Welcome to Shootin' Straight. I'm your host, Ken Buck. In today's highly partisan environment, political adversaries often minimize each other's arguments by labeling motives rather than engaging in constructive dialogue. For the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you to join me as we learn more about Marc Morano and how he came to be a leading expert on climate issues and environmental conservatism. We will learn about Marc's interest in forests and conservation and how he has become one of the premier scholars on the truth about the Green New Deal. He is author of the book, Green Fraud. It is my pleasure to welcome Marc to the show. Are you ready to start shooting straight?
Yes, Ken. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. I guess my first question is, how did you develop an interest in this climate change, Green New Deal area?
Well, I always grew up considering myself an environmentalist. I always felt I was conservative, except when it came to environmental issues. So I've always loved the great outdoors, fishing, hiking, trees. I wanted to be a forest ranger. So I took a keen interest in environmental issues. My mom grew up in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and she grew up in the Great Depression. Her dad, my grandfather, was a coal miner. So I come from that background of the sort of Great Depression mentality, they'd call it, where the idea is everything had to be conserved. You would store a conservation ethic. And I fully feel that I grew up like that. I still remember in the 1970s, particularly growing up, my dad pounding on the door, "That's enough water, or turn off the light." So we were always energy conscious back as growing up. And I love the outdoors. So I was always interested in environmental issues. And then later in life, had a sort of red pill moment when I realized that they were exploiting environmental issues for political purposes.
So parents grew up in the Great Depression, and I can remember just shelves and shelves of canned goods and
Yes.
All kinds of things. Did that happen in your home also?
Yeah, we had the storehouse downstairs. We had the soda and toilet paper and paper towels and canned goods. It was a very, very common, apparently, if people grew up during the Great Depression, because they never trusted banks either. It was, the idea is, they were told the world was one place, and then, of course, everything collapsed. And so none of the official organs of government could be depended on, so they took measures into their own hands in that regard.
So you have this basically frugality in your past, and you grow up as what we would call a conservationist, not necessarily an environmentalist, yes, but a conservationist, where we treated water special, and especially in the West, they say whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting, because it is so precious in an arid area. But then also the whole idea that was instilled by your parents, that these things, they weren't going to be here forever if we didn't take care of them, I guess is what I'm
yes,
gathering.
And even politically, though, my dad would always, the political influence aside from the conservation, he would always, say, this is the reason we went and fought, in World War II, we fought for these freedoms. And now governments, every time government overreach, he always compared it in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington. They had confiscatory tax rates back in the 80s, leading to huge tax revolts. He always called it like the old serfdom days and the feudal system. And so he instilled in that, that blend of the frugality with politics, and he thought government should be just as frugal as people would be. And the problem is, as we know today in 2021, government is anything but frugal on any level at this point.
What was your first exposure to politics?
It was at age 12, 11 actually, going into 12. I was a volunteer. My older brother worked on the 1980 Ronald Reagan campaign, and it was actually fascinating because it was the nexus of politics and the media. Back then, they had reel-to-reel tapes and cartridges, and I would go in on every Saturday during the fall of 1980, and I would call radio stations around the country and say, I have Governor Reagan talking about, the Iranian hostage crisis. Would you like a soundbite? Or Governor Reagan talking about his new economic plan. And they'd call radio producers. I had a list, and then I would play the tape, and they would record it. And that's how I got my first taste of politics and the media emerging.
So then you go to college, and another influence on your worldview.
Yeah, I went to George Mason University and actually had a professor, Walter Williams, and got to know him and interviewed him over the years. And he quoted me in his columns. I featured him in my film. I did an Amazon rainforest documentary. But he was a huge influence. His writings and books, along with people Milton Friedman, who wrote Free to Choose. So I was really interested in the free market economics in the size and scope of government. And so when I saw how environmentalism was being used sort of as a cover for massive expansion of government, that really made me interested in this. But my original concern was about deforestation, Amazon rainforest. I was all in on that, watching the National Geographic specials, how many football fields a minute. It wasn't until years after that, in the later 90s, the early 90s it began, but the later 90s I did a documentary on the Amazon rainforest and went down and interviewed environmentalists in Brazil who would scream and throw down the books and say this is BS and curse and say these are all lies. It's one of the most intact forests on the planet. Even the New York Times in 2007 said for every acre of rainforest cut, 50 are being regenerated. And people are leaving the jungles and moving into urban areas. So the whole Amazon rainforest scare was just completely overblown. And now they can reforest. So that was a huge eye-opener for me. So by the time Green New Deal, of course, came along, I was already skeptical of a lot of environmental claims. And I never fell in with the climate change scare.
When you were younger, did you ever have any dreams of working in forests and doing?
Yes. In fact, I remember filling out a survey in school, and my ideal job came out to be a forest ranger in like a national park. I always loved the idea of living in the trees and camping and hiking, and I just thought that would be an ideal job.
What was your first exposure? You mentioned the Amazon rainforest. What was your first exposure to that story, and how did that develop?
Actually, I ended up working for Rush Limbaugh, the television show. I was his DC correspondent. But even prior to that, the year on his radio show, he had Dixie Lee Ray, a nuclear physicist, who was on doing live reports from the Rio Earth Summit. Is when President George H.W. Bush went down in 1992 and signed the Rio Earth Summit. And that's when I heard originally about her saying that this Amazon, this is what you're hearing is not true. It is not endangered. It is not intact. And that's when I started my quest. That was an eye opener for me because it was like, whoa, I'd been hearing this for at least 5 to 10 years about deforestation, Amazon. So I started investigating that, and it was almost like, once you start peeling the banana, everything started coming across because I started realizing all the other environmental issues. And I still consider myself a conservationist. I want clean air, clean water, but I don't want it to be exploited for political purposes and as a Trojan horse, as a cover for other agendas, which is what happened when the United Nations got involved, when the Green New Deal came about, and when they started getting into the whole climate agenda.
That's sort of evolved. The Amazon rainforest evolved at some point into climate change. But before climate change, we had global warming, and before we had global warming, we had global cooling.
Yes.
And you lived through and covered the global cooling debate. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in Green Fraud, I have a whole chapter on the 1970s global. You might think, well, isn't that a little excessive, a whole chapter? No. Before fossil fuels caused global warming, fossil fuels caused global cooling in the 1970s. The theory was that our fossil fuel burning was creating these aerosol clouds, which were blocking the sun, creating global dimming, which was then causing less sunlight to reach the Earth, and we were going to freeze to death. We have ABC News, we have the CIA, we have NASA scientists, you have all the major Time, Newsweek, you have letters to President Nixon from top leading scientists warning of a man-made global cooling scare and that we must act. All the same hallmarks of global warming were there. Ken, you had worries about a tipping point. Scientists are worried that they won't act in time. Floods, droughts, bad weather caused by man-made global cooling. You had a national security threat that we heard today about global warming. The threat then was of global cooling that was going to cause resource. And by the way, that's a legitimate threat. Global cooling times are when you have actual national security because that's when you have crop failure. It's warming times that you don't. But in the 1970s, we saw the same show we're watching today with the Green New Deal play out. And it was amazing because the solutions were the same. Sovereignty limiting treaties, wealth redistribution, cutting down on capitalism, restriction of movement. We have John Holdren, who later became Obama's science advisor, writing in 1975, lamenting that people could hop in their car, drive to a grocery store, get a six-pack of beer, and drive home. You get an idea that that's the progressive vision. They don't want human beings to be free. They want us micromanaged, ruled by expert, ruled by some greater public health / environmental emergency that makes it so we have to be controlled by these bureaucrats. And by the way, these are experts. They've studied in school decades. They have masters and PhD. Who are we to say that we can run our lives better than these people who have all these credentials? And we saw this play out even recently with the endless COVID lockdowns.
The one phrase that drives me crazy is I believe in science. And I just think that is such an arrogant phrase, but it goes right back to this point, something that we've lived through very recently. If you don't agree with me, you're ignorant because I have degrees and I've studied this, and you can't have another opinion than this opinion. Obviously, when you talk about global cooling, eventually there were other opinions. And what was the transition from global cooling to global
That was
warming?
Fascinating, because in my first book, Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, I found that transition. It was 1977 in the New York Times. And there was meteorologists versus climatologists. Now, most people associate meteorologists with TV weathermen and climatologists with the longer-term study. But in the 1977 New York Times article, they talked about how meteorologists were warning, were pitted against the climatologists about global cooling versus global warming. And you can actually see a real debate on the pages of the New York Times, a science debate. But then it sort of went quiet after that sort of flurry of debating in the late 70s. And global warming really didn't emerge again until a major issue, until 82, 83. And even then, it was still quiet. Al Gore had a hearing, I believe, in the House or Senate when he was elected in 84. But it really wasn't until 1989 that the whole climate issue came to fore. That's when we had the NASA scientists come testify. That's when the United Nations Climate Panel, 1988, the United Nations Climate Panel came into existence. So they transitioned pretty easily. And interestingly enough, people like Stephen Snyder was a huge global cooling alarmist in the 1970s. He became a big global warming alarmist. And then you had scientists like Reed Bryson, who was considered the father of modern meteorology from the University of Wisconsin. He was a global cooling alarmist. And by the time global warming came around, he was a global warming skeptic. So it was fascinating to watch all the different variations. But the media and the scientific establishment, academia, squelched all that debate. And then in 1988, just decided that climate was the greatest threat we faced. And then they became all in pretty much on climate to the exclusion of all the other environmental issues.
Did they ever admit they were wrong? How did they?
No.
I mean, if you're a Raiders fan, you don't go to being a Broncos fan.
Yeah.
If you're a Redskins fan, you don't go to being a Giants fan. How did they?
That is a great question, because I've asked that, and in all my research, I looked at that. People like Paul Ehrlich, provably wrong about the overpopulation myth. His book predicted mass famines, resource scarcity, mass death, all because there'd be too many people. He was proposing adding sterilization agents in drinking water in Africa and in developed countries. I mean, it was scary stuff. This guy, and even today, he's still alive, almost 90, you think he's 89 or 90. He'll still ask, were you wrong? And he says, no, I wasn't wrong. They haven't come true yet. In other words, he was a little bit off on the timeline. So if I predict a death for someone and they haven't died 30 years later, you could still say, well, they're going to die eventually, so I was right. In a way, Paul Ehrlich is sort of taking that tack, but completely wrong, never apologized. 1970s, they were asked, you could talk to people like Stephen Snyder, and they'll say, oh, they act like they never believed it. And there was actually a study out saying the 1970s global cooling scare was a myth. It never happened. And it's like, I'm sorry, what? Which then led to people digging up hundreds of articles, multiple peer-reviewed studies, quotes from the scientists who said it, all the mainstream media. I mean, they try to do it, and it's good enough for, say, the Facebook and Google fact checkers, which, by the way, are not fact checkers. You mentioned the science. The Google, Facebook, YouTube, all they do is they're consensus enforcers. And we shouldn't call them fact checkers. They actually admit this. Facebook, YouTube, they'll admit if you say anything against the climate that disagrees, say, with the United Nations or on COVID or with the World Health Organization, suddenly you don't have a valid opinion. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's against the enforced consensus. And that's where the science comes in. It's an agreed upon narrative by those in power that there can be no dissent. And if you disagree, you're against the science.
So we go from global cooling to global warming.
Yes.
And we've been in an industrialized society for 100 years by that time. We've been emitting carbon. We've been emitting other things as a result of the smokestacks and other industrialized processes we go through. How did they describe these differently? Were they describing global cooling is a result of this and global warming as a result of something different, or they're the result of the same thing?
Well, mostly they ignored the fact that they ever did. I mean, they really did. They just act like it never happened. We never talked about global cooling. That was a myth. That was, one article. They just dismiss it. If you pin them down, they would say, well, we thought that the aerosols blocking the sun were going to be dominant, but now we realize with the new science that carbon dioxide is going to be driving the climate and causing runaway feedbacks. And if you go back to that 88, 90, even into the early 90s, there was actually debate. Ted Koppel, Nightline, would host debates with Al Gore and Rush Limbaugh on environmentalism. You had C-SPAN hosted. There was actually a scientific debate. It really wasn't until mid to later 90s, particularly Kyoto Protocol would have been 97, that they just decided the media narrative went from this is pretty much agreed to. There was still some debate, but certainly by 2007, Al Gore's film came out, and that is when they decided no debate would be alive. The media announced there were only half a dozen dissenting scientists around the world, and the same number who believed the earth was flat. The demonization was in, the politics had overtaken the movement. There would be, I'm not talking about scientists who won Nobel Prizes, scientists who were former UN, scientists from MIT. I interviewed University of Pennsylvania. Ivy League geologist has been on almost every continent studying climate. He's got hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He never bought into this scare. He went and saw Gore's film and was horrified. But you won't find him interviewed by the media. You won't find him called up to Congress to testify by anyone. But it's an amazing thing because these scientists were just silenced. And it became politics because they had a political narrative. The UN, we know this from all the ClimateGate emails. If you dissented, if you were a scientist who dissented, you were not invited. You were deplatformed in the day. You could lose your university. They threatened journal editors of scientific journals. If you publish this paper saying the sun is the predominant factor, you will not get our papers anymore. You will have your job threatened. So it was an amazing thing, run like a campaign cause. In other words, if something was off message, you had to stay on message, and everything they did was done that way. And that's the way the science is run today with climate.
So it went from global cooling to global warming, and then we got into climate change.
Yeah, we got into
they
climate
changed
change.
the name again because they couldn't show. Well, you tell me, why did they change?
Very simply, I was actually at the Bali United Nations Climate Conference. By the way, I was working for the U.S. Senate, Environment and Public Works. My round trip ticket was about $14,000, $15,000 to Bali. Business class, which is like first class, lay down flight. This is one of the reasons this climate agenda is so attractive. They have more CO2 emissions at these UN summits than entire African nations do in multiple years combined. That's how much comes in. But at that summit in Bali, it was an aide to John McCain, who at the time, John McCain was big on the cap and trade. He was co-sponsoring the bill. They were talking openly, and I remember we actually had a debate about this. He said, we're going to be changing the name now to climate change because A, there was a temperature pause going on. The temperature had gone up to about the late 90s with this big El Nino, and then they had sort of plateaued. They said that we're going to be focusing more on extreme weather. So any bad weather event, this is why they like the name climate change, because it was the idea is that anything that happened could be blamed on climate change. Whereas if you had years of no temperature increase or blizzard, you couldn't really blame it. And true to their word, within a couple years, we had the snowiest winters ever on the East Coast, most snow ever, multiple blizzards. And Al Gore came out and announced the blizzards are a consequence of global warming. On the pages of the New York Times and all these other scientists who previously said snow is a thing of the past, suddenly said this is consistent with what you'd expect, all this record snow. So that's why it was important to get away from climate change. And now, of course, they have new names like global climate disruption, global weirding. None of it hides the fact that on climate timescales, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires are either not increasing or decreasing. And in many cases, in tornadoes, we're at record lows that they've ever measured.
Can we agree that there is more CO2 in the atmosphere now than there was previously?
Yes, there is. And carbon dioxide, about 80% of the increase in man-made CO2, we're about 410, 411 parts per million, came after World War II. So even with industrialization, it still wasn't that significant. So the idea is after World War II, with the great post-war boom, that's when the big CO2 jump happened. However, if you look at the geologic history of the Earth, and I interview geologists and scientists, and I feature charts that show this, that 90% of the Earth's history had CO2 levels much, much higher than today. In other words, it was a natural climate change of natural CO2 cycle. So yes, we've increased CO2 in recent hundreds of years. But if you look back at the history, it's not. And also 90% of the Earth's history was too warm to have ice at either pole. So we're in the 10% coldest period, geologically speaking. More important than that, the Roman warming period of about 0 AD, if If you look at peer-reviewed studies and all that, this shows it was as warm or warmer than today. So we probably cooled. The medieval warming period from 900 to 1300, we probably are as warm, we probably about the same temperature or cooled. So the idea that we're unprecedented, the idea that CO2 is driving a climate catastrophe is not tenable. More CO2 equals a warmer world in theory, but there's hundreds of other factors that overwhelm it. Everything from tilt of the Earth's atmosphere to ocean cycles to water vapor to clouds, methane, the sun, just to mention a few. So that's where we get into the flaws. But the key is, yes, climate is changing. Climate has always changed. Man contributes to it, but you may not be able to distinguish man's impact from natural climate variability. And if you look at the temperature, storms, polar bears, sea level rise, which hasn't accelerated. Obama scientist Steve Koonin just came out. He was in Obama's Energy Department, a physicist from NYU, no conservative, and talked about sea level rise not being about the same rate as it was 80 years ago. They do not have it. Where they get the scary scenarios and the science is when current reality fails to alarm, they make scarier and scarier predictions of the future.
Tell me about Patrick Moore.
Patrick Moore was a big influence on me. I met him in the 1990s. He was a former co-founder of Greenpeace, one of the original founding members in, I believe, 1970. On the warrior ship up in Canada, and they were fighting nuclear war and all that. But he ended up leaving Greenpeace in the 80s because he said it just became a against everything type of group for socialism, and they were even against chlorinated water at one point. So he came out what he calls the rational environmental policy. He's a climate skeptic. He's a species extinction skeptic. He's testified to Congress before on that. They're doing the same thing they're doing with climate now with species extinction scares. He is just a font of information. He's a PhD scientist, and he is such a threat to Greenpeace that when he came out against and started talking about the Green New Deal and climate a few years ago, Google and Greenpeace erased him from their website. And if you looked up Patrick Moore's name, you couldn't find it anymore on the Greenpeace website or in a Google search. But thanks to the Wayback Machine, you can still find the fact that Greenpeace had listed Patrick Moore as one of their co-founders for decades. But when his message became inconvenient, they tried to erase history, much the way the old Soviet system would get rid of commissars who fell out of favor with Joseph Stalin. They would just airbrush him out of the picture.
One of the phrases that I remember hearing from the Obama administration, and I'm sure it goes back much further than that, the left always talks about never let a crisis go to waste.
Yes.
And even if it's a manufactured crisis, never let it go to waste. And one of the things that I'm really wondering about, on the left, we talk about social economic planning and social programs and making sure that everyone has a guaranteed job, and somehow the climate crisis has now merged with all of their economic plans in this Green New Deal. And is it just coincidence that they've used this crisis as a way of promoting their economic plans? No.
Rob Emanuel, I believe, who said never let a crisis go to waste. I went to Czech Republic and interviewed former Czech President Václav Klaus. He grew up under the Soviet system and all the repression. He was, I believe, the first president when they broke off free, or second, one of their presidents. He actually said it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet system, the international left latched on to environmentalism to achieve those same centrally planned goals. And that's what we're finding here. In the book, I detail how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a member of the National Democratic Socialists. I believe that's the exact name. And the idea is they married themselves up with the environmental movement. Mikhail Gorbachev got involved in the green movement after the fall of the Soviet Union, as another example. And so what's happened is they can't sell the merits of a Bernie Sanders vision of America on politics and culture alone. So they have to hide it behind some kind of crisis. And the crisis they've chosen is the climate emergency. We face a climate crisis. This does several things. It means you can't argue about the Green New Deal and its merits because you're against the science. We have to do this because the climate crisis. You're not a scientist. You haven't studied the science. You don't have a degree in climatology. But if they tried to sell the Green New Deal on just the merits of economics, of ending, meat eating, going after cows, giving guaranteed annual income, they would lose, and they know it. So that's why they use the climate scare as a cover for their agenda.
So tell me about some of the features of the Green New Deal that are absolutely inconsistent with the environmental agenda.
Well, much like President Biden's infrastructure plan, which only 5 to 10% is infrastructure, the Green New Deal is very similar. Only 5 to 10% even deals with climate or energy. The rest of it is about guaranteed income, healthcare, identity politics, social equity, and just kind of weird stuff like remove buildings and put up only green buildings, only allowing housing to be built when you have zero carbon footprint. So they go through on all of this wacky stuff. No farting cows. It's a thing that's a remaking of our society way beyond anything to do with climate and energy. And what Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal is trying to do is implement it under that cover of the climate scare. And even now, you have people like Andrew Yang, a big supporter of the Green New Deal, saying things like we have to abolish private car ownership because we have to have instead have a roving fleet of rental electric cars. So the Green New Deal is going to go after everything from your appliances to your home thermostat to what you wear to your freedom of movement. They're talking about under a climate emergency, you can't fly unless it's morally justifiable. You want to fly to Florida? Well, unless it's for a funeral, you got to justify to a government bureaucrat. If it's for a vacation, you already had one. This is where we're headed, where you have to go to a government bureaucrat and apply for freedom to travel. Keep in mind, just to bring up COVID again, the COVID lockdowns set the stage for this. Stay-at-home order, curfew. You couldn't have X amount of people at a backyard barbecue. You'd think this was some scary vision of America. John Kerry, Al Gore, UN chief, Greta Thunberg, all the climate activists, academia, praised the lockdowns and praised all of that as a solution that we should have done years ago for climate. And why not? Because global emissions dropped, I believe, 7% in the year of lockdown. And that was exactly in line with what the UN wanted. So you're getting an idea of what their true agenda is. And their agenda isn't climate control, it's controlling humans ultimately. Every aspect of our life, our diets, they're going after meat eating. Former UN chief has said meat eating has to be made like smokers in restaurants, put in their own section. European climate leaders have said we have to make meat eating so expensive that we'll move over. And of course, what they want to replace it with, they promote eating insects. They promote the processed fake vegetable oil meat burgers. Al Gore's all in on that, trying to be the world's first fake meat billionaire. He had an IPO timed with the UN report on agriculture. So as he's lobbying the Biden administration now for this green stimulus part of the infrastructure, and he's got investments in companies, $70 million, according to the Washington Post, that he's going to benefit from. So they get away with all of this because they're on the right side of the science, Ken.
I guess the science has nothing to do with economics. What if they actually implemented some of these plans? What would the impact be on the environment?
Well, that's a great question. Multiple things. First of all, if you're just concerned about the climate, they would raise carbon dioxide emissions, period. Carbon taxes on Europe and the United States would raise carbon dioxide levels, period, emissions. So if you actually cared about it, all it's going to do is outsource American domestic energy and Canadian energy in Europe to third world countries.
So how would it raise the CO2 emissions?
Because it's going to outsource our mining, factory, drilling, in oil and gas exploration to countries that don't have the same environmental standards and or access to the same technological advancements. So we're going to have a cruder version, particularly countries like China. Now, if you're worried about the environment, this is a disaster for the environment. All we're going to be doing is outsourcing our energy and mining now to China. They own 90% of the world's rare earth, cobalt in Africa, Chinese-owned companies facing huge human rights violations. Accusations of child labor by Amnesty International, other human rights organizations. This is going to be a great boon to Russia, who's going to be filling up European coffers of oil. The Biden administration's fine with their pipelines in Russia, in Europe, but we're shutting down our pipelines in America. So what it means is we're going to be relying on solar and wind and electric car battery production. And that is massive mining operations. And that is going to essentially take away our ability for domestic energy, which is a national security threat, which means we're going to be moving over to reliance on China, back to reliance on Middle Eastern oil, as they go forward with this net zero madness of the Biden administration and in the Green New Deal.
Instead of producing energy here and using the energy here and producing energy in a way that you can put it in a pipeline and bring it to a market, We're now going to produce or buy energy from a foreign source, ship it across the ocean in huge tankers, either natural gas or oil, bring it to this country, refine it in this country. And the countries that we're buying it from have lower environmental standards and producing more global pollutants than otherwise. And then on the manufacturing side, we've got a country like China who buys coal from the United States, has it shipped to China, and burns that coal in a much less environmentally friendly way than we do here in this country, and then ships those products over to the United States. So as President Trump was talking about making America first in manufacturing and energy production, that would reduce the CO2 emissions worldwide. And what the Green New Deal is talking about, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that would raise the CO2 emissions worldwide.
Yes, and be environmentally destructive. And that's the other thing. You're talking about a massive mining operation for all these rare earth metals. And keep in mind, okay, a couple things here. President Trump. Under President Trump, the United States had the biggest reductions of carbon dioxide levels of any country in the developed world. We were just radically dropped. The European signatories of the UN Paris Agreement came nowhere close to us, in many cases increased, and they're the ones that were able to shame us, like, oh, look, Trump pulled us out of the UN Paris. Meanwhile, we were the ones leading the world in reducing CO2 emissions. And why? Because natural gas fracking replaced coal use. And I go in the book, in Green Fraud, I show you, I think it was 12 or 13 years ago, the Energy Information Institute showed all these projections of where energy is going to be. They missed it by a country mile. Every single prediction, no one foresaw this fracking revolution overtaking coal and radically reducing American CO2 emissions. It's a phenomena. And this is why with technology and wealth and free markets, this is what you get. You can't predict the future like that. But instead, what happened was under President Trump, 2019, it's the first time since Harry S. Truman was president in 1952, we had more energy exports than imports. For the first time since Dwight David Eisenhower was president in 1957, we have more energy production than consumption. We become the world's largest producer of oil and gas. All of that, we weren't just energy independent, we were energy dominant. All these people like climate activists like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., all American wars have been fought in one way over access to oil and energy. Well, great, okay, let's accept Robert F. Kennedy's climate activist vision. Under President Trump, we don't have to go to the Middle East anymore to fight for that. We are energy dominant. We have more consumption, more production than consumption, more exports than imports. We're the world's largest producer. We've arrived. And then what happens? President Joe Biden's elected and just starts dismantling one thing after another, going after the Keystone Pipeline, even the labor unions. I quote Terry O'Sullivan in the book, who says this is just outrageous of what Obama and Biden are doing to his union workers in America, the ones who would be building the pipelines, the ones who would be working in mining, working in the energy extraction. It's an amazing thing because they're even turning against their own base on this. But this is what we're facing, and it's all for this ideology, but it's got nothing to do with the climate or the environment. It's really about, this is the progressive left thinking that climate is the greatest tool to achieve their agenda. And by the way, I do at the end of the book amend that point slightly by saying a virus scare like COVID, which is a real virus, they never let a crisis go to waste. The idea now is climate is now secondary to a virus because a virus is much scarier to many more people than climate. So what's going to happen is climate is going to become part of the COVID lockdown, sort of permanent lockdown movement where they're saying no return to new normal. And that's where they actually say, if we don't deal with climate change with a Green New Deal or UN Paris, we're going to have more viruses like COVID. So that's the way they're trying to merge the two. And I detail that at the end of the book. Anything that's crisis that scares people, they're all in to push authoritarian progressivism on America.
Well, and every issue that I can think of is related to climate. The immigration issue is caused by climate. More wars are caused by climate. More agricultural production, less agricultural production caused by climate change. Anything that concerns somebody is blamed on climate change.
15 years ago, it was so quaint. Al Gore's film, we actually looked at polar bears, sea level emissions, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That was how you measured climate. Well, then fast forward, now we're suddenly looking at vehicle theft statistics, break-ins, rapes, airline turbulence, all these wacky things. And then solution now, we used to talk about cap and trade, carbon taxes, or UN agreement, but now we're talking about, ending white supremacy. We're talking about defunding, abolishing the police, canceling pet ownership. I mean, not having more kids. The whole debate has morphed now into this sort of grab bag wish list of every, progressive wish list of what they would like to see. And that's how they measure climate and how they solve it. We have NASA lead scientists coming out who are supposed to be dispassionately looking at the science. A lady named Dr. Kate Marvel and another scientist from another NASA division saying that climate change is caused by white supremacy. Until we deal with the racism, we're going to have runaway climate change. Al Gore is all in on this as well. I mean, so it's just amazing how whatever their progressive issue of the day is, they turn it into the science. So if you question white supremacy causing global warming, you're a science denier, which, by the way, they want to put you in jail for that. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wants climate deniers at The Hague with all the other war criminals with 3 hots and a cot. Bill Nye is open to the idea. Here's a kicker, though. The New York Times actually wrote that more crime is good for the environment because more people locked up have lower carbon footprints. In other words, releasing prisoners increases global warming because the prisoners get out and they suddenly have all this, they end up using more energy, which releases more CO2 in the atmosphere, which makes you wonder why they love lockdowns, endless lockdowns so much, because we were all locked down with lower carbon footprints. But this is the progressive agenda we're dealing with. It's a really frightening agenda. It has nothing to do with climate and environment. They're just using that as cover for their real agenda, which is just controlling humans and that whole academic wish list of regulatory control on every aspect of your life.
Well, Mark, thank you. And thank you for writing Green Fraud and certainly recommend it to people and hope they read it. And tell me, how can people get a hold of you if they have questions for you?
You can go to my website, climatedepot.com. And Mark Stein wrote the foreword to this. It's worth it just for that. He's hilarious. But he actually, because there's efforts to get Amazon to ban my book now, because Amazon's supposed to be a climate champion, he was offering to sign anyone who orders a book from Stein online. We also have it available at cfac.org.
So I have a question I want to ask you that I ask all my guests. If loving this is wrong, I don't want to be right. What is this?
I had to go back to my childhood. If loving the Three Stooges is wrong, I don't want to be, because I got my kids I got them watching them. I've had Three Stooges t-shirts, figurines, so it's one of my favorite things in the world.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for listening today. I hope this program has been informative, enlightening, and uniting. As Americans struggle with the difficult issues facing our country, we are reminded that good policy is a result of open, thoughtful discussion. For more straight shooting programs, go to my website, shootinstraightpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this show and have ideas about future topics or guests, shoot me an email, ken@shootinstraightpodcast.com. God bless you, and remember to shoot straight.